Can I honestly, considering everything, call the Persona series gay? No.
Are we gonna be safe alone with you?
But also, yes.
I like you. Move. I'm gay!
You're me and I'm you.
It's a controversial topic for a reason, and if you don't trust what I have to say, then you're not going to find an easy answer anywhere else, and that's because it changes depending on who you ask. Since I first played Persona 4 a decade ago, I've seen opinions shift from the series being a brave new front for representation in JRPGs to being seen as an insult to the queer community and an example of entrenched traditional values. For a little context, Persona is an RPG series developed and published by Japanese game studio Atlus. The gameplay has become distinct through its hybrid approach of life simulation to flesh out the world and its characters, combined with traditional dungeon crawling turn-based combat. While each entry is largely self-contained, they have some recurring elements like certain characters and themes. The games will reference each other occasionally, but story-wise you could start with any entry in the series. Over the last decade, the series has also seen a massive spike in popularity, with the momentum built up by the success of Persona 4 laying the perfect foundation for Persona 5 to be a cultural phenomenon, unquestionably solidifying the series as a mainstream gaming staple. The series has been printing Atlus money since then, with new additions, spin-offs every year, and porting the modern trilogy to anything that can play it, all building up to this year's remake of Persona 3 being the fastest selling title in the series. And with this surge of popularity, new fans are joining the ranks every day, with new opinions, and no one can seem to agree on how the series treats queerness. Persona is one of those series that has a strange ability to draw in the deepest gay corners of fan-based culture to become passionate fans, as well as equally appealing to the dead opposite of this. And of course, everyone in between. What about Persona gives it such an all-encompassing appeal, especially for a JRPG series, which is usually a pretty niche genre? You can probably tell already that it's not a straightforward answer, and depending on how much you already know about the series and its 28-year-long history, you might have an insight into why. But I don't just want to look into why the series attracts a varied player base, I also want to look into the games themselves and see if either side of this fanbase is more correct than the other when it comes to their opinions on Persona. For every Aegis, there's a beautiful lady on the beach. For every Jun, there's a pair of predators in Shinjuku. For every Yosuke, there's a Yosuke. As much as people might want to convince you otherwise, you can't really stamp Persona as gay culture or straight territory. That's why coming off the tails of Persona 3 Reload, and with Persona 6 getting ever closer, it feels like an impossible task to predict where the series is heading. When publicly predicting what might be included in Persona 6, I've seen people getting backlash for not understanding the series and what would and wouldn't be in a Persona game. But to know the series, you can't really keep making sweeping statements about it as a whole, and instead need to go into each entry individually. So, where to start? Going to Persona 3 first might seem like a strange choice with how obvious the topics for discussion are with almost every other entry, especially considering for the longest time 3 largely lived in the shadows of its successors. It had only 2 years of being the latest entry in the series compared to the 8 Persona 4 had, and now Persona 5 has as well. And with 4 being the entry to arguably bring the series to the forefront and 5 solidifying that, no wonder it's been so easy to forget Persona 3 within the context of the modern trilogy. And that's not even considering the other aspects of Persona 3 that can make it seem unappealing to newcomers. I personally avoided the game until Reload because of how much I heard people complain about Tartarus, the game's controversial main dungeon. You can argue that with Persona 3 always being seen as an awkward underdog, it's been the favourite pick for a lot of people as overlooked and underrated, giving it the title of a cult classic. But it can't really claim that title anymore with the newest iteration, Reload, launching in a world where Persona is a much more well-known name, making it, as I mentioned, the fastest selling title in the series. Even so, having a look at any version of Persona 3 without context, you could struggle to notice any queer aspects on one playthrough. But what makes it unique is just how much you can recognise when you compare the changes between every version of the game. With Persona 3 Reload being the first incarnation of Persona 3 I sat down and finished, I was naturally curious about the differences there are between this version, the 2006 original, Persona 3 Fez, the definitive edition released a year later, and Portable, the PSP port with its own host of changes from 2009. So let's start with the OG and work our way up to where we are now. Looking for queer main characters in vanilla Persona 3 won't get you very far. Arguably the closest you could get is some subtext between Ryoji and the main character, but in vanilla 3 there isn't much to work with. I've seen some people debate that the Temperance Arcana social link Bebe, André Laurent Jean Giraud, could be seen as gay. I mean, he is French, but other than that, interpretation of his potential sexuality is pretty open-ended, since his social link doesn't really focus on anything related to that. But with 3 being the first Persona title to have romance be a more fleshed out mechanic compared to the previous games, and the game launching in 2006, it's understandable that Atlus wouldn't go out their way to include a gay option. If we're looking at something more obscure, there is an unnamed female NPC who hangs around the high school corridors who makes comments idolizing Mitsuru to the extent where it's pretty clear there are romantic feelings. Her dedication goes so far that she's managed to survive every version of Persona 3 since the beginning. So, good for her. Aside from that though, there isn't much else queer, unless of course we're overlooking a shining example of Atlus's comedic writing with Beautiful Lady on the Beach. During the party's summer getaway, Junpei suggests Operation Babe Hunt, while him, the player character, and Akihiko are on the beach. As the trio flounder around, unable to get any numbers from the ladies they encounter, they eventually start to make some progress with an NPC called Beautiful Lady. After she flirts with the three for a while, Akihiko points out a hair on the woman's chin, leading to her quickly being renamed Beautiful Lady with a question mark. She panics, then the boys panic, then she flirts with them some more and leaves. Panic around trans women was already a tired trope in 2006, and that hasn't changed since. This scene remains unchanged in the next 2 versions of Persona 3, but it turns out the Beautiful Lady hasn't been completely forgotten, but more on that in Reload. Compared to the next 2 versions, there really isn't too much different with Fez, since most of what is added is in the answer epilogue, following on from where Vanilla 3 finished. I won't get into this too much, since firstly, there won't really be any chance of me avoiding spoilers for how 3 ends, but more importantly, there isn't really much to talk about for this topic at least. However, Fez does strongly focus on the character of Aegis, who has been a main party member since the original Persona 3, but in terms of this conversation, she only becomes more relevant when playing Portable is a weird one, and is part of the reason why talking about Persona 3's different versions can be difficult. Unlike with Vanilla 3 to Fez, Portable doesn't keep just adding content, but also takes some away, likely for the sake of all of Persona 3 fitting on the PSP. The answer epilogue from Fez was removed, but instead we now have the option to play as a female main character. Being able to play as Kotone adds some gender-specific scenes, but arguably the most significant inclusion is the exclusive romance options depending on who you play as. This led to the controversial inclusion of Ken Amada as a romance option, but I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. However, what it doesn't change creates some pretty gay implications. The main example is the aforementioned Aegis. Her romance from the male route of Persona 3 is left mostly unchanged. Early on, she'll make reference to not being able to be with Kotone because she's female. But clearly, her perception has changed by the end, with clear implications of romance. This is an often overlooked piece of representation since it's hidden in the female route of what used to be a semi-inaccessible JRPG. But in 2023, Portable was chosen to be ported to modern systems instead of Fez, so this option for Aegis has made a slight resurgence. And since Aegis is seemingly more of a mascot for Free than Koromaru is, this is a pretty big deal. Another character who is sometimes overlooked in this conversation is a female Velvet Room companion Elizabeth, who our protagonist can take on dates if she chooses her instead of her brother Theodore. The final date with her is definitely changed from the male main character's version, but there is still a pretty strong sense of romance too, which a lot of players picked up on. However, perhaps the most interesting queer context for Persona 3 isn't in a same gender romance options for Kotone, but for a male one. When playing as a female main character, a whole host of male romance options unavailable in the male route open up, and one of these is pivotal plot point character Ryoji, who's introduced relatively late in the game. His social link plays out like a lot of other romances for the female main character, but he notably mentions during one conversation, "I would still like you no matter if you were a guy or a girl." This has of course been interpreted as him indirectly coming out as bisexual through his dedication to Kotone, and when considering the potential romantic tension between him and the male main character present from all the way back in vanilla Persona 3, you can understand why some people really don't combat this aspect of his character. Of course, some people do, using 2 main pieces of evidence. Firstly, that Ryoji flirts with just about every female character he talks to, and secondly, he might just be saying that to Kotone and not really mean it. The reason I can see why it's relatively easy to look past these counterpoints is the nature of the relationship between Ryoji and the main character, no matter their gender. He's shown to be completely honest with them and avoid pretense, unlike the more shallow relationships he has with other characters. So saying something like this to Kotone and not really meaning it would be massively out of character considering the context. Someone picking up on this style of potentially homoerotic subtext between the blank slate male main character and a charming, charismatic, kind of flamboyant and something definitely hidden under the surface that's important to the plot other male character is a bit of a recurring theme in Persona fandom circles. A recurring theme that has recurred twice to be exact, but more on him later. But of course, none of this changes the fact that you can't romance Ryoji as the male protagonist. But that also doesn't change the fact that he explicitly comes out to his girlfriend when playing as Kotone, so that's nice for him. Skip ahead 15 years and you have Persona 3 Reload, and the funny thing about this remake is that it takes away just as much that adds like Portable, making it just as controversial to purists as it does people wanting their money's worth. I was pretty frustrated finding out that the epilogue from Fez was being added as DLC, and that Kotone just isn't an option anymore, so say goodbye to bisexual Aegis, Elizabeth and Ryoji, and just Theodore in general. However, that's definitely not to say that there isn't anything to mention here. The main difference is that the infamous Beautiful Lady, whose scene remained largely unchanged between Vanilla, Fez and the male route of Portable, has finally been adjusted. Now renamed to Pretty Lady, her first few lines remain almost identical, but instead of Akihiko pointing out facial hair, this time she starts ranting and rambling about conspiracy theories like the sun being artificial, prompting the group to retreat. At first glance, this scene is a definite improvement over the original, and it's nice to see that somewhere in the 15 years between Portable and Reload, someone at Atlus realised that the joke had aged poorly. However, this change didn't please everyone, with complaints from both sides. If you follow JRPGs in any capacity, you can probably predict the reaction from the anti-localization, anti-translation, should probably just learn Japanese at this point crowd. The best example of these complaints I found was in a forum post titled "Very Saddened About the Censorship," with the original post saying,
"With the game being in the wild and people playing, it seems like they scrubbed an iconic beach scene and it's no longer in the game. I'm almost expecting some Western staff to now tweet about how they fixed the game and did everyone a favour by removing stuff. Removing scenes isn't something a mod can fix. I don't think I want to buy this game anymore."
Ironically though, nothing was changed with the English translation of the game, with the Japanese version also featuring the conspiracy theorist. Even so, the thread was largely met with people saying it really isn't that deep, with users saying that scene was never iconic, and if the lack of a 2-minute cheap joke is too much for you to handle, it's your loss, man. Aside from the pseudo-censorship complaints, there were some more thoughtful cases as well. In Robin B's opinion piece, she mentions,
"If the only way Persona 3 Reload can avoid being transphobic is by removing trans people entirely, it's suggesting that the trans woman was the problem, not the transphobes. Considering Atlus's history of portraying gay and trans people as predators and punchlines, the solution needs to be more than erasure."
And you can see where she's coming from. Sure, no transphobia is better than transphobia, but also getting rid of the only trans character present can't feel great for trans Persona players either. So looking at Reload for the queer scorecard, it's a -1 for removing a trans character, but I guess +1 for removing transphobia. So does it do anything else to tip the scales? Yeah, kinda. In the grand scheme, this is so minor when compared to more explicit examples, but in a new animated cutscene from the beginning of Reload, we get a frame of a school bag featuring a rainbow pin or badge. Some have guessed that it belongs to the Mitsuru-loving lesbian, but we'll never know for sure. And what's also worth noting is that this frame was included in a pre-release trailer for the remake, so there was plenty of time for analysis and discussion before the game was out. For example, note that I didn't call it a pride pin, and that's because there was debate over whether this is just an innocent rainbow or an actual symbol of gay pride. However, I think as do others, this was pretty clearly intended to be seen as a symbol of pride. One Reddit user summed it up pretty cynically, saying,
"The trailer is targeted marketing. A person had to make the creative decision that out of 60 plus hours of footage from a full playthrough of the game, this specific shot would be chosen to blast out as part of a marketing push. There's no way that it was an accident."
And even if you use the argument that to a Japanese audience the rainbow is simply a rainbow, gay pride imagery in Japan features the same use of rainbows as it does elsewhere, and either way, Japan is aware of gay people, so feigning the argument of complete cultural ignorance is as inaccurate as it is patronising. Of course, this pride pin quickly became the most controversial animated frame in a trailer for a day or two, leading to some calling it a bombshell for diversity, and others mourning its inclusion, calling the game woke Sona free, and saying the game is butchered. In spite of these relatively extreme reactions, as you can see, the game ended up being pretty neutral, getting rid of the tactless trans representation, but also removing all of the queer content added in Portable. Through it all, at least Mitsuru's lesbian is still there. If we slightly overlook fairs, the differences between the different versions of Persona 3 in terms of queer representation, or lack thereof, are pretty staggering for games that are supposed to be the same game. Looking back at how different 3's different iterations are, it's not just interesting to see what has been included and taken out in the 18 years between Vanilla and Reload, but also how this reflects on what Atlus wants to include in their most popular franchise. So, where does this leave the franchise moving forward? Well, with Reload leaving us with a pretty even playing field, it's hard to predict. So, what comes after 3?
Wow, a gun! I wonder if it's loaded.